Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again on Saturday, the 27th of June. And this is another thought for the day. No, not so much a thought for the day as something to think about, something thought provoking. Maybe that's a better way to describe it, because I want us to consider how we prepare for worship. Now, I know worship is a whole life thing. We should be worshipping the Lord in some way or another as we go through our routine day after day after day. But I'm talking specifically here about those times when we gather together for worship. Now, I know that's not possible at the moment in the fullest sense, but even tomorrow, Sunday, we are hoping to gather together in some way, online, digitally, or as families, to worship the Lord. Now, for those occasions, the question I'm asking is, how do we prepare for worship in that sense? You know, I'm sure we've all heard stories, and indeed I remember times when there used to be an awful lot of preparation done for a Sunday. In fact, when I was growing up, it wasn't referred to as Sunday. It was actually the Lord's Day. If it was just Sunday, well, it was like any other day, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever. But when you said it was the Lord's Day, it had this overtone of being a day that belonged to Him in its entirety. It wasn't so much for us, it wasn't for our enjoyment, our recreation, our amusement. It was the Lord's Day, and it was to be devoted to Him in its entirety. And because of that, there was an awful lot of preparation that had to be made. For example, a lot of people would have prepared their food on the Saturday so that they wouldn't have to cook throughout the Sunday. They would just have a cold meal or whatever. There was always the case when you had to get your clothes ready the night before. You couldn't leave it to Sunday to sort something like that out. You especially couldn't polish your shoes on a Sunday. Remember the days when you had to polish your shoes? No, you had to do all that on the Saturday night in preparation for the Sunday, where you could devote your whole time and attention to the Lord. And of course, in those days, there were no shops open, maybe one or two selling necessities. But by and large, the shops were all closed. Nobody went to work. Everybody had Sunday off, unless you worked in some sort of an emergency service or provided some sort of necessity. There was no television to be watched. There was no sport, either on television or being played out and about. And even places of recreation were closed because it was the Lord's Day. Now, I'm not advocating those days, friends, and I don't want to go back to those days. I personally am not a strict Sabbatarian. I do lament the fact that the Lord's Day is becoming like any other day. It's being made completely secularized, and I think we're the poorer because of that, and families are suffering because of that as well. But again, I know that preparing for worship and preparing for the Lord's Day isn't all about doing stuff, doing external things. Because an awful lot of people back in the day, they rebelled against having to do all this and then not being allowed to do what they wanted on a Sunday. So although they went through the motions and they got their clothes ready and they polished their shoes and so forth, their heart wasn't in it, and they weren't really preparing themselves for worship because they resented, they were in the wrong frame of mind. And I know that preparing for worship properly, it's an internal thing. We've got to prepare our hearts and our minds for worship and engage in worship with hearts and minds rather than going through the motions that we're not particularly fond of. So it does bring me back to the question though, how do we prepare for worship? I know we've left the past behind. For example, in the Old Testament times, there was an awful lot of preparation to be done before each Sabbath. There was rituals that had to be undertaken. There was ceremonies that had to be performed. There was all sorts of cleansing, all sorts of labour-intensive things to be done in preparation for the Sunday. Now again, we've left a lot of that ceremony behind, but it still doesn't answer my question. How do we prepare for worship? Inwardly, how do we prepare? Well, I suppose it's very easy to sit there and say we prepare in prayer. Okay, I accept that, but is that what we actually do? Do we spend perhaps Saturday evening in prayer in preparation for Sunday? Or do we spend a time on Sunday morning in prayer before we gather for worship? How is it that we are preparing ourselves for worship? Is worship the highlight of the week? I'm suggesting that for Christians, perhaps it ought to be. I know, again, our whole life should be one of worship for the Lord, but I'm talking here specifically about those times when we come together as people of like mind in one place when we can to worship the Lord together. Okay, is that the highlight of your week? I suggest, as a follower of Christ, it should be. It should be something that we look forward to. Now, speaking personally, again, when I was a lot younger, the highlight of my week, before I was involved in the things of the Lord, the highlight of my week wasn't a Sunday at all. It was Saturday. I was quite active in various sports, and sports were confined to a Saturday, no sport on Sunday. So that was the highlight of my week. It usually consisted of football in the morning, a golf match in the afternoon, and sometimes even sandwiched between that, there was a cross-country race. And that was all on the one day. So I had to make sure that I prepared myself for the highlight of my week, the sport on the Saturday. And that involved all sorts of things beforehand, well beforehand. I had to make sure that I was well rested and got enough sleep. I was beginning to get to the stage where I was a wee bit more fussy about what I was going to eat. I certainly had to get all my equipment prepared, get my kit laid out. I had to get all the golf gear organised as well. So there was an ongoing preparation in anticipation for the highlight of what was then my week. Now, as believers, if we take that illustration into the realm of preparing for worship on a Sunday, first of all, I would like to think that the Sunday is the highlight of our week. And if that's the case, what ongoing preparation do we make for that highlight? That whole day being given over to the Lord. Just going back to my original question, friends, how do you and I, how do we prepare for worship? How do we still our hearts before the Lord, shut out the things that we are occupied with throughout the week, and bring the very best of our time and our attention to the Lord on a Sunday? Or do we not prepare at all? Are we guilty of just rushing into God's presence? You know, we prepare for appointments during the week. If we have to see somebody important, see our boss, see about an interview or whatever. We prepare for those things because they're important. What could be more important than gathering with God's people and worshipping and praising his name? Do you not think we should give proper attention and prepare correctly for worshipping the Lord in that way? As I've said, if this post goes out on a Saturday, and if you're watching it on the day in which it's posted, tomorrow is Sunday. How are you preparing for worship tomorrow? I leave the thought with you, friends. Please think about it as you pray, as you wash your hands, as you keep looking up, and as you keep preparing. Thanks for listening. I look forward to speaking to you again soon. In fact, I look forward to worshipping with you tomorrow on the Lord's Day. I'll see you then. Bye for now.